Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Oley Foundation webinar, You Should Totally Meditate, Realistic Effective Strategies to Cope with Day-to-Day Life with HPEN. My name is Andrea Guidi. I am the Executive Assistant for the Oley Foundation. Most of you are probably familiar with the Oley Foundation, but just in case this is your first experience, I'd like to briefly introduce the organization. The Oley Foundation strives to enrich the lives of those living with home nutrition support, both intravenous nutrition, sometimes called HPN or TPN, and tube feeding. We do this through education, outreach, and networking. The Oley Foundation was founded in 1983 by Dr. Lynn Howard and her patient, Clarence Oley Oldenburg. Today, we serve approximately 20,000 members. All of our programs are free of charge for patients and their families. Before we start the presentation, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping details. You should see a toolbar on the right side of your screen. Click on the orange arrow to show the control panel. In the questions section, you can type any questions you have for me or for the presenter. Please note that we will not be responding to the hand-raising function in the control panel. We will answer as many of the questions as possible during the question and answers period at the end of the presentation. We'll post a recording of the presentation after the webinar on the Oley website. Please note that we have muted all of the participants, so you don't need to worry if there's background noise where you are taking the webinar. Now for the presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Tiffany Taft. Dr. Taft is a clinical psychologist from Chicago, Illinois, a research assistant professor and director of psychogastroenterology research at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, and founder of Oak Park Behavioral Medicine, a private psychology practice specializing in treating patients with chronic digestive diseases. She has published extensively on psychosocial aspects of digestive diseases, with interest in stigma, fatigue, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Dr. Taft presented psychosocial issues related to intestinal failure at the Oley UI Health Combined Conference in Lincolnshire, Illinois this past June, and an edited transcript of an interview with Dr. Taft on the subject of PTSD was published in the Lifeline letter, the September-October 2018 issue. We are so thankful to have you presenting today, Dr. Taft, and I will turn the presentation over to you now.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that is joining us today for this hopefully useful presentation on how to apply some day-to-day strategies to cope with life with HPN. Let me just bring up my presentation. Okay, so today I want to try to give you some effective strategies that I would give patients coming into my practice to see me. These are some of the foundational things that we teach all of our patients that we see in our practices before we move on to any other more complicated treatments that we might be doing. And I think for most people, yeah.
Do you want to put that in, I guess, slideshow format a little bit bigger? I see that. I think you have it, but it doesn't look like it on my screen.
It should be. It's coming up with the notes thing. Can you see that?
I do see that.
Okay. Is the go to webinar panel in front of it or no?
I just see your slides on the side as well.
Okay. I'm sorry about the technical problem, folks.
No, no worries.
I don't want it right with the notes on the side. Can you hand it off to me again? I'll try something different.
Absolutely.
Actually, let me try. I'll do this.
Okay.
I changed it to main screen. My apologies. Hopefully that will show. Is that better?
Actually, that I see the same notes as well.
Okay. How's that?
That's perfect.
Okay, sorry
Great.
about that. Technical
That's okay. We got
problem.
it straightened out.
Okay, so before I get started, I just want to mention brief disclosures. I do some speaking engagements for AbbVie with physician education on communication skills. And then as was mentioned, I am the owner of Oak Park Behavioral Medicine here in Chicago. So as was mentioned in that lovely introduction, I am a clinical psychologist and I specialize in working with patients with medical illness. So that is a thing that just like in medicine, psychologists can specialize in various things. And so there is a whole subset of psychologists who work with people with medical illness. I happen to specialize in gastrointestinal illness, which is an even, deeper level of training, but those are much more rare, unfortunately. I am in private practice, and I also am a research assistant professor here at Northwestern. And just from a personal disclosure, I've had Crohn's since 2002, and then I was fortunate to develop eosinophilic esophagitis in 2016, which I joke that I caught from my research, because that is one of the diseases that I do research here at Northwestern. So I do have a bit of a patient perspective as well. So I want to go over just quickly the psychological impacts of nutrition and supplemental nutrition, and then what is clinical health psychology for your information, and then what are some of the treatments that we use, and then really the meat of the presentation today is how can you implement these strategies in your own, in your day-to-day life. So the potential impacts of any chronic illness, and I think especially digestive disease, and then those needing, HPN are many, right? And I could do a presentation on each one of these bullet points, and we have touched on mostly anxiety and depression and quality of life, but we get into other things like intimacy, stigma, something called disordered eating, which is not eating disorders that you may have heard of, like anorexia or bulimia, but just, the fear of anxiety, food anxieties that can develop. People adjust their eating and may over adjust or do more than is helpful, even though it feels like it is giving the person some control over things, and then it ends up turning into a problem. So that's what we mean. We say disordered eating. And then sexuality, body image. I did a webinar on body image. Just all of these things that can happen as you go through your life with your condition. But I was looking through. This is from my talk that I did here a few months ago in Chicago. It's been recognized since at least 1979 that we really must be aware of the psychosocial factors involved. So this was published in a prominent journal 40 years ago, saying that we really need to pay attention to this. But I think that this is an area of care for patients that we just don't have enough resources in place, and it has been slow, unfortunately, for a lot of physicians to acknowledge the role of psychosocial impacts in patient outcomes. And this is more than mood and worry, especially when we get into HPN, in that it's not just the biological value of food, but getting into nutritional deficits that can happen, that can have neurocognitive impacts on attention and memory and language and executive function, which is fancy term for complex tasks, solving problems that human beings do on a daily basis. Those things can be difficult to do if your nutrition isn't in the right place. The eating impacts, missing your favorite food, food taking on new meanings, cravings, embarrassment of having to explain things to others. And then also health-related quality of life, which is something that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So some statistics, the good news is that most people, using HPN have, quote, reasonably good quality of life. And a lot of people will say, my quality of life improved once I was able to get the right nutrition in my life. But we also know, and I love these ranges when I do these reviews of the literature, 10 to 80%, well, it's probably somewhere in between, in the middle there, have depression from mild to severe. There's a decent amount of people having anxiety, social impacts, sexual concerns, difficulty traveling. Fatigue is a huge problem, and a lot of digestive diseases, other diseases as well, but fatigue is a big issue that seems to happen regardless of disease activity sometimes, and also concentration difficulties. So enough people are having a difficult time that we really need to focus in on some of these mental health concerns. So what is health-related quality of life? It's something that we research a lot, and it's a very broad topic, and includes physical health, mental health, functional status, financial, social support, resources that you may have from just accessibility to supplies, formulas, insurance coverage, things like that. And it's just a general measure of the burden of a chronic illness. So there was a study that I found looking at 700 patients from 14 countries using HPN and what were the impacts on quality of life. So I looked across the bottom of the graph are all these different domains. And the three biggest impacts that we found, the authors found, was holiday or going on vacation and traveling, employment, and then sexual function being the poorest area of quality of life. Where other areas definitely saw some impacts, but those were the places that people using HPN were having the most trouble. So what helps? Sometimes it's simply the passage of time. We do know that being diagnosed or needing HPN at a younger age is more predictive of a better outcome. Being able to maintain your identity, so your work, your family structure, your financial stability, positive social support, and being connected to a patient organization like Oley. These are all things that predict better outcomes across these domains of quality of life. So what is it that I do, or what is clinical health psychology? So this is something that's been around for a very long time. We have our own journals, research journals, we have our own societies, annual conferences, you name it. So it's the interdisciplinary field where we are concerned with the behavioral, psychosocial, and biomedical aspects of health and illness. And so we combine all of these together to try to help people have better lives. Because if an illness is chronic, we have to learn how to navigate life in spite of it and live our life to the best that we can. So clinical health psychologists are dedicated to helping patients do that. And there's something called the Biopsychosocial Model, which came out back in 1979, same year as that article that I referenced earlier. And it's a switch from the biomedical model, which looks at the body and mind as separate entities. And that goes way back to early philosophies. And instead, we've shifted to, no, we have to look at the mind, the body, even spirituality has been added to this model in terms of how an illness will affect somebody's life. And the biopsychosocial model incorporates all of these aspects, and they are all overlapping and contribute to a person's health. And one thing, that is coming up in the research literature more and more these days is the impact of past trauma. So childhood adverse events or struggles or even traumatic experiences, and how those affect things like the gut microbiome, which is a hot area of interest these days, in digestive diseases, and the brain as well, and how that can lead to digestive problems later on. So that's a definite area of attention that is coming up these days. So in GI psychology or psychogastroenterology, we look at something called the GI stress cycle, in that the brain and the gut are intricately wired together, and we can turn our symptoms can turn into a cycle of stress just by being concerned about having symptoms. So looking at how I'm worried about my digestive system can cause my symptoms, unfortunately, to become worse. And this isn't any intention of placing blame, but rather it's a normal thing to pay attention to your digestive system if you're having cramping or diarrhea or nausea. But then how do I respond to that? What do I do? And sometimes what I do is like pouring a little bit of gasoline on the fire and can perpetuate symptoms. So one of the things that I do with patients is help them identify, are you doing anything that might be causing this GI stress cycle to be going on? And the good news is we can break it, but we have to become aware of what we're doing first. And that's what I'll get into a little bit later. But, you know, in the meantime, I might start developing some habits. So I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a long time ago. And so I've learned over the years how to navigate life with that. And if my disease is active, I might plan my day and my eating around that. So if I have meetings, I have to do this webinar, I might skip breakfast because I don't want to have to get up and run to the bathroom. I might wait till the end of the day, you know, so I have a sense of control over what's going on. If I don't want to eat at all, if I can't eat at all, so I can avoid experiencing pain. Spending a lot of time on the internet and looking at Dr. Google. We love Dr. Google and we do not like Dr. Google. It can be really helpful to become educated. We always advocate for people to learn about their disease and their treatment. And, you know, with HPN, it's so complicated. So you need to know, you know, what you're doing when you go into your appointments, but then you can kind of go down the rabbit hole of the internet and get into stories and anecdotal evidence that might not be as helpful. And you might actually start feeling worse and more anxious or more down, depending. So you have to be a little bit careful there. And sometimes we say the heck with it, you know, and we eat, if we can, we eat the food that we desperately crave, and we know it'll hurt, but it'll hurt later, but we eat it anyway. You know, so we're constantly gauging, is it worth it? Should I have this food today? If, you know, if you're on partial HPN, but you can have some other foods, should I eat that today? It's like, yeah, I'm going to. You know, it's such a balance of making decisions that I don't think people that don't live with conditions that affect your ability to eat food truly understand. And other things that can come in, you know, being bored with eating the same things, fear of trying new foods, or even fear of trying old foods that may have triggered symptoms in the past. You can't just sit down and enjoy a meal with friends. In the United States, so much of our social lives go around food and eating and drinking. And if you can't do that, what does that mean for you? Can I still go out with my friends and not feel awkward? Or not have people ask me all sorts of questions that I don't really feel like answering. I just want to go out and have a good time. So these are all things that start to come up as well. So what do I do, or what do psychologists do? These are the main treatments that we use. There are others. There are a lot of psychological treatments out there, but these are the ones that have been the most researched in digestive disease and have the most evidence to support them. So we like to say, hey, like, what does the research say on these things? None of these are perfect, but these are the ones that tend to show the best outcomes in helping patients with various issues related to managing their disease. So cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which under that falls something called behavioral self-management. Gut-directed hypnotherapy, which if you've seen the movie Get Out, that's where that image is from. It has an interesting use of hypnosis in the movie. I'll leave it at that. And I just want to say, if you have seen it, I never drink tea while doing hypnotherapy with my patients. And it's not nearly as exciting as the movie portrays it to be. And then mindfulness-based therapy, and then acceptance and commitment therapy. So again, I could do a talk on each one of these bullet points, but I'm going to try and take some of the the techniques from some of these approaches and give them to you today to hopefully be able to use on your own. So the nice thing about psychogastroenterology treatments, it's non-drug strategy. You know, there's no side effects. They are effective. In general, these treatments work about 60 to 70% of the time, depending on what we're looking at. And if I put that into context with some of the medications that are used for something, you know, like gastroparesis or irritable bowel syndrome, those medication effectiveness percentages are closer to 40%. So some of these things, you know, really do a good job. And the nice thing is there aren't any drug side effects. The cons are it takes practice and motivation, and there's a lack of people like myself trained in GI disease to give these to people in one-on-one, you know, therapy sessions. So there are trade-offs here, but you know, we really need to look at this brain-gut connection and use the treatments as we can to help make symptoms better. There are also many barriers, unfortunately, to accessing mental health care in general in the United States, and from what I understand, also overseas. And so we totally recognize that and understand that. And I actually did a study with inflammatory bowel disease patients a few years ago, just asking them, what have your experiences been, you know, out in the community, not coming here to a university-based specialty center, but just out in the community getting help. And these were the main barriers that people reported. The good news is that most of their doctors were not discounting the value of the therapy or saying it was ineffective, but it really was related to cost and the lack of therapists that understood IBD. And we could take IBD out of that and put in any other diagnosis, you know, that even understanding HPN, but understanding gastroparesis and other conditions that are highly stigmatized. I think that these two issues are really what are keeping people from being able to come in. And also inadequate insurance coverage was another reason. So Dr. Phil is a very popular psychologist on TV, but he does not really portray, unfortunately, an accurate picture when it comes to what needs to be done to make meaningful change. He's very nice entertainment. But contrary to what he says, you know, it does take time and practice, and there'll be starts and stops, but you can do things on your own if given the proper tools. So what I'd like you to do first as we kind of go through this, or after the webinar is over, is to evaluate three things. The first being your social network or your social supports. The second, your self-care. What are you doing now to kind of take care of yourself? And then the third being how you think about things or evaluate experiences that you have. So how is my social network? And one of the things that we know is important is disclosing an illness to at least a few people that you trust. People that try to keep themselves completely hidden in terms of their illness identity tend to have worse outcomes, because if you think about how stressful it would be to hide an illness, especially an illness requiring HPN, that would be like a full-time job almost. And the fear of being outed or being discovered, all of that stress actually leads to worse outcomes. So having those trusted people to talk to, it only needs to be a couple of people that you can really be open with, can really be helpful. So who can I count on? But also who might not be the most helpful? And I think this comes up more often than I would hope. And a lot of times the people will say, well, it's a family member, you know, my spouse or my mom or my dad or my kid is not really being that supportive or helpful. And it's hard to divorce yourself from family members, so it becomes setting boundaries and you know, protecting yourself from people that you may not be able to cut ties with, but who might not be helpful. So seeking support from the right people is very important. What online resources do I use, and are they helpful? I mentioned earlier Dr. Google, but there's also message boards and support groups and social media these days. And again, I feel like these can be very great sources of support, but then you can get sometimes people in the groups that cause more drama or cause more problems or have real catastrophic stories. And so asking yourself, how do I feel after I've used, my online resources? Do I feel better? Or do I feel more tense or down? And so looking at if they're the right resource for you. And then also, how's my relationship with my doctor? And I know that this can be pretty variable. And sometimes you have to go through a couple of doctors before you find the right one. Depending on where you live, hopefully that's an option. But if you are struggling with your relationship with your doctor, are there things that could be done to fix it, or is it beyond repair? And then looking to see if there are other options to help with your care. And I love this image from Pins and Procrastination on chronic illness bingo. So these are all the things that a lot of people with illnesses are asked, and I love some of these. Dr. Oz says, another one of the doctors that Oprah gave us, or just unsolicited advice or questions or recommendations that really cannot be that helpful. But I think, unfortunately, because of images like this, really highlight how common these questions are. And if you're fearing this a lot from your social network, that's a cue that maybe you need to have a shift in terms of who you talk to about what's going on with you if they're not asking you helpful questions like are on this bingo card. Also looking at, am I taking, basic care of myself? What are you doing right now to de-stress, and does it work? Are you able to stick with anything that you've tried, or do you find yourself bouncing from, one thing to the next without really finding something that's helping you to de-stress? Unfortunately, watching TV is not a good way to de-stress. I get asked that all the time. It really doesn't help you de-stress. It's distracting, but it's not a good method to try and bring down stress in your body. If you're not exercising regularly, why aren't you? It doesn't have to be jogging or anything intense. If you don't have the stamina or you're not well enough to do something, even just going for short walks can be helpful. If you are able to eat some food, how's my diet? Or if you are strictly on formula or IV nutrition, are you staying on top of your volume? Are you getting in all of your feedings? How's your nutrition there as well? How's my sleep? And then how much downtime do I allow myself every day? So these are just some things to think about as we go through the rest of the presentation. Again, what have you tried? What works? And then what doesn't work? I think one of my biggest frustrations with things is, oh, everybody's meditating right now. And I'm here to say it doesn't work for everybody. It works for most people, but it doesn't mean that it works for everybody. And then you're not a failure, or there isn't something wrong with you if you've tried things and it just doesn't work for you. You may not have known the right way to go about it, or may have tried it at the wrong time in your life, and I'll get into that a little bit later. The other thing that I want to talk about is our thinking or thinking traps. And all of these little thought bubbles are thinking traps that I can't unfortunately get into too much detail today, but are so common that we have lists of them. And so mind reading, I am going to assume that someone is thinking something about me without really having much evidence to support that. Or catastrophic thinking, that's a big one. The worst case scenario is going to happen, and I think more importantly, I'm going to underestimate my ability to cope with that situation. And I think we really do that a lot, where we think this is going to happen, there's no way I can deal with it, and then yet we do. But then the next thing comes up, and then we forget, almost how resilient we've been in the past, but this time it's going to be different. It's going to be so bad. And then it's not. And so we can look at, are we being catastrophic in our thinking, overgeneralizing, personalizing, all these things that so many people do on a regular basis. So really where you should start, and we start with everybody that we see with this, and yes, diaphragmatic breathing, it is a magical thing. It really is our only way that we can control our nervous system directly. So by doing slower, deeper breathing, we can directly impact our blood pressure, our body temperature, especially our peripheral body temperature. So if you have a lot of the time cold hands and feet, that is a sign of stress. And if you do some diaphragmatic breathing, your hands will actually get warmer. Muscle tension is reduced. All of this is by looking or by targeting the central nervous system. And it's when we are under stress, our nervous system is designed to become more active and try and figure out what's going on and get us out of the problem, the fight or flight response, if you will. So diaphragmatic breathing affects those processes in the nervous system. It also affects our digestive system, including hypersensitivity of the nerves that can happen in the digestive system, whether it's in something more neurological and a problem of the brain-gut interaction, or a residual hypersensitivity from damage, from inflammation, from something like inflammatory bowel disease. Diaphragmatic breathing also helps with worry, so anxiety about anything, but I said specifically symptoms or hypervigilance, paying really close attention to what's going on in my body, and even mood. So yeah, it really does do a lot. And the wonderful thing is there are a lot of free or very cheap apps. So I'm all about the technology. So if you have a smartphone, it is your new best friend after this talk, and I'll get into some of the apps I recommend. So diaphragmatic or belly breathing, as it's sometimes called, I borrowed this from our Canadian friends, is pretty simple. You sit or lie down in a quiet place. So you want to make sure your kids aren't running around. Someone isn't going to come knock on the door. You only need, a few minutes to do this. And then close your eyes and make sure to relax your shoulders. Those are a great barometer for how you're doing with stress. If they're up by your ears, you're probably feeling some stress. And you want to put one hand on your chest and one on your belly. And just breathe slowly in and out, and really feel that hand on your stomach move. A lot of times we turn into chest breathers as adults, so we're taking more rapid, shallow breaths, which doesn't really get a lot of oxygen to our body and actually causes us to feel more tense. So slowly breathing in for 3 or 4 seconds. You can adjust the time. It's not critical that it be 3. Some people are more comfortable with 4 or 5, with the goal being getting your number of breaths per minute down to about 8 to 10, even 6 when you get really good at this. It may feel a little strange in the beginning. If you're more of a chest breather, it may feel uncomfortable for you. Some people actually feel a little bit anxious when they start doing this. And only a very small percentage of people cannot do this, but just keep practicing every day, for 5 minutes, and just keep repeating it. And I promise you that it will likely start to show benefit after a couple of weeks. So everything I'm going to talk about, I want you to try for at least 2 weeks before you make any assessment of if it's working for you. And don't do it on your worst stressful day that you've ever had, because your body is going to be so keyed up that trying to do this for the first time on a day that you got really bad news and you're just feeling horrible might be the equivalent of bringing a fire extinguisher to a 5-alarm fire. You want to do your practice until you get good at it during lower stress days. And yes, you should try meditation. I know I made fun of it in the title of my talk, but it really is a helpful an effective way to do many things, including reducing pain, controlling that negative thinking that I mentioned, doing the same effects on the cardiovascular system, and just providing a sense of calm and peace and balance. But again, this is a skill that takes time and practice. And if you have tried meditation, you said, this didn't work for me, I ask you to try it again using some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about. So this is a nice graphic that I found, on how to meditate. And the same rules apply as to the diaphragmatic breathing, practicing 3 to 4 times a week for at least 2 weeks before you decide if it's helpful or not doing it during your peak stress time. And in the beginning, your mind is going to wander. It's going to go to your grocery list, the fact that you need to buy ketchup, that you got to go pick up your kid, or some jerky thing that your coworker said to you. Like it's guaranteed that will happen. But with time and practice, again, about 2 weeks or so of regular practice, those thoughts should start to slow down or even stop. So really taking the time to practice, and I'm going to recommend some apps that you can use to help guide you. Sometimes people try to just sit and meditate on their own, and the quiet is too much. It's too much of a change of what they're used to. And so sometimes a guided meditation with some of the apps that are available really helps people get into it more. So these are 4 apps. I don't get any kickbacks that I recommend: Calm, Headspace, Stop, Breathe, Think, and Buddhify. They all have different kind of features to them. Some you pay a monthly fee. They all have a free trial period as far as I know. And some you pay one time and then you get all of the stuff in them. So check them out and see which one works best for you. The other thing I recommend is cognitive behavioral therapy strategies, and the basic tenets of CBT are: something happens, I have a thought, so I interpret the situation, I have emotions, but I also have physical reactions to that. I might feel tightness in my abdomen, or my stomach might hurt, or I might get a headache, but I have those physical responses in addition to feelings: anxious, sad, angry, frustrated. And then I behave in some way. So I respond to the situation in kind to how I'm feeling. And so that is the foundation of CBT. So we teach people this. And unfortunately, our brains are like a lot like cell phones. We're in a conversation with some friends, yet we have a range of notifications going on in the background. So the phone is doing what it's supposed to be doing, but then in the background, there's all these other things that are going on. It's like, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that. And there's a lot going on in our brains, even when we're engaged in something that maybe has all of our attention. So it can get a little out of hand. I've turned off a lot of these little red bubbles on my phone because I can't handle looking at them. I feel compelled to have to click on and take a look, so I turn them off so I don't know. The good news is we can manage our notifications. Just on our phone, we can manage the notifications and how much our brain is letting us know about things that maybe we don't need to be paying attention to at that time. So this is kind of a nice analogy for anxiety. I can control how much time and attention I give the notifications or the worries or concerns that I have. And I'm going to go into a couple of ways to do that. So the first thing to do, if you're feeling like your mind is racing and there's a lot of anxiety going on, or even if you're feeling down, if you're really noticing a shift in your mood, tell yourself stop, take some deep breaths, as I mentioned, and just observe, what am I thinking right now? And that sounds like a simple thing, but a lot of people don't really know what they're thinking. I'll ask them, so what were you thinking in that situation? And they just look at me because they never really thought about that. And it's like getting at those thoughts is a great way to take the wheel when it comes to some of our worries and mood issues. So write it down. And this is a little worksheet that we would use with someone. You know, what was the scenario? How was I feeling? What was I thinking? What did I do? Did it work? And then also, what else could I have done? Writing things down is an excellent strategy to get a good sense of what's going on. If you try and keep it all in your brain and evaluate only in your head, it's not going to work. So get a journal and start writing these things down. And again, give this at least 2 weeks of practice before you start to, decide whether this is something that works for you. I recommend having a little notebook. If you want to use your phone, the Notes app, or even one of these apps that has CBT built into it, you can do it there as well. Keeping it next to your bed is a nice place to kind of write stuff down at the end of the day, especially if you're having some insomnia or difficulty falling asleep. Writing things down helps our brain put it aside and not have to think about it as much. Use your relaxation skills while you're doing this. Imagery is a great practice as well. Letting tension go. So using your relaxation skills in addition to writing things down can help give you some clarity. So starting to look at what are some of the images or thoughts that are coming up, and then writing them down after you get into that more relaxed state. If you're having a hard time identifying some of your thoughts, sometimes slowing down, using the relaxation, and then getting the notebook out can be a nice combination approach. So some questions to ask yourself after you write them down is, how useful is my thought? If it's not a very helpful thought, it's not really getting me anywhere or what I want to do or where I want to be, you might want to think about, letting that thought go or changing it. What is the evidence to support it? Would it stand up in court, for example? If I came to someone and argued my thought, would they think, well, that there isn't anything to support that? If there isn't, then it's something to reconsider as well. That this really applies with the mind reading and catastrophizing that I mentioned earlier. And what are some alternative explanations? Is it a solvable problem? And what would I tell a friend is really helpful. We're really good at helping other people, but maybe not as good at helping ourselves. So that's a nice strategy that a lot of people would like. Well, yeah, I would tell my friend that. It's like, well, why don't you tell yourself the same thing? And that sometimes helps people that can't come up with things for themselves. Replacing the negative with the positive is another nice strategy. This isn't the power of positive thinking per se, but if a lot of my self-talk that I'm writing down on my thought record is negative, sometimes it is helpful to come up with the opposite. So I'm meeting someone new and they won't like me. Well, what could I say to myself instead? Even something neutral. Well, let's see how it goes, or they will like me. We have a lot in common. I think it'll go well. And even if it doesn't go well, that's okay. So these types of reframing to a more positive or even neutral bend on how you're thinking about things can really take some of the power out of negative thinking. And doing something that you've never done. I'm scared. Can be, instead of I'm scared, I'm excited. Fear and excitement feel very similar in the body. So sometimes these strategies can be helpful for some people. I really like writing. I think kids, are drawn to diaries and journals for a reason. And I think we as adults could do ourselves some good by writing things down on a regular basis. So it doesn't have to be formal. It can be anything that you want it to be. Just writing down, what you would like to write down, review and reflect on it. Again, taking deep breaths. I hope you see some themes here in what I'm saying. And just writing for about 5 to 15 minutes straight, and then rereading what you've written and reflecting on it as well can be helpful. And, sometimes people will keep the journal and look back on it later. Sometimes people will throw their writing entries away when they're done. It really is up to you what you want to do with it. But just the act of writing down some of your thoughts and worries really can be helpful. It's okay to write only a few words. You can write a few pages. Just write however you would like. Write authentically. And don't worry about how well you write. You're not writing an essay for school. Just get it out there on paper. And I like this quote from Michael J. Fox on acceptance, because I say this to patients. They're like, we need to talk about maybe accepting what's going on in your life. And they get mad at me because they're saying, well, you're saying I'm giving in or giving up. I said, no, this isn't a solvable problem per se. Your disease isn't going to go away. So Michael J. Fox living with Parkinson's, it means that I'm understanding that something is what it is, and there's got to be a way through it. So there's a whole treatment in psychology called acceptance and commitment therapy, and you can find therapists that do ACT. If this is something that seems like it would be useful for you if you wanted to see someone professionally, and it looks at things like your values, being present, focusing on the here and now, willing to experience difficult thoughts, looking at your commitment to pursue important things in life. So ACT can be really helpful in situations that you can't change. If you do need to be on HPN for a long time, accepting that that's part of your treatment, now what? What am I going to do with that? Instead of fighting against it, I'm going to go with the flow, so to speak. So really looking at what your values are is, I think, a great step. What is really important, the most important things that give your life meaning and purpose. And so, evaluating, is it my relationships? Is it being a good parent? Is it my career, my community, making a difference? Once you identify these, it helps you take the energy that you do have. So if you are low on energy, or spoons, if you adhere to the spoon theory, where are you going to put that energy? And so if you put that into valued activities, you're going to feel a lot better in terms of less stressed, happier, more fulfilled. So we really encourage patients with chronic illness and chronic pain to look at their values and divert as much of their energy as they can. We understand, we can't all do all valuable stuff all the time, but if it can be a nice chunk of our time, we'll feel better. And so guess what? You write them down, and there are ACT worksheets on the internet. I just went out and Googled that. And so these are some of the things that I found to go from struggle and suffering to a rich and meaningful life. So what matters to you in the big picture? What personal qualities and strengths do you want to develop? Versus what am I doing right now that might not be helpful or making my life worse or wasting my time and money or energy? Do I have any negative relationships? So looking at what's going on that might not be helpful, and then putting that in the context of your values and goals and how to attain them is a nice strategy. Also getting present. So this looks familiar to what I've already talked about, noticing what's going on around you, noticing 5 things that you can see, hear, feel, using all of your senses is a nice way to be present in the moment. You can do this, when you're doing anything, washing the dishes, walking in the park, again, just engaging with your environment as you go through your day is a nice way to turn off the autopilot that most of us put on every day. We miss out on a lot of things. And so just slowing down and being mindful in just general pleasant activities that you're doing throughout your day can be helpful. These are some resources that I, put up for hopefully later access on the webinar. You can take a look at them on your own time. Resilience is another word that's being used a lot, and some people roll their eyes at that as well or get upset when I use that term. But I think, it isn't being numb. So we're not saying you're giving up with acceptance and you're just being numb by being resilient, but you, again, go through these things. You fall, you fail, you hurt, but you keep going. So what the heck is this? I like the analogy of the palm tree in the wind. They bend quite a bit before, they break. And so resilience is like the palm tree in that, we can adapt and adjust to the winds that, may come to us in life. And we have our natural resilience that we're born with. So all humans have resilience. Our adaptive resilience, or how we learn to change and adapt based on the challenges that we face. And then restored resilience is things that you learn specifically to help tap into your natural resilience. Sometimes we lose sight of what we can do, kind of going with that catastrophizing, right? And I underestimate how resilient I actually am. So this restoring it and learning these strategies can help. So one approach is, stating the facts, placing blame where it belongs, reframing, and giving yourself time. So I use a scenario of needing your catheter replaced again. Talk about it in plain language without magnifying it, taking ownership but not beating yourself up about it. Reframe and reevaluate the situation. Sure, needing to have your catheter replaced is never fun, and it's risky, and you don't want to have another surgery or another procedure, but if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. And I've done it before, and I'll get through it, and I'll do it again. And take time to heal and adjust. Solitude if you want to. Humor, I use humor a lot, probably too much. Maybe do a relaxation exercise can help as well. These are some apps that are good for gratitude, which goes with resilience. Again, give them a try, see which one you like. They all are kind of a little different, have different ways of paying for them, but they just help us focus on things to be appreciative of when life can be pretty difficult. And here are some resources as well that you can look at a later time. So if you go through all these things, you try these things out, and you're like, I'm still not doing well. Consider meeting with someone like myself or a psychologist or a social worker who at least specializes in patients with chronic medical conditions. They don't have to be a GI psychologist. That'll be difficult to find. But really finding the right fit. So that's really what successful therapy means. And here are some questions that you can ask. So what is your approach to treatment? You can ask them specifically about cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. How many patients have you seen with my illness or who've used HPN? Do you have any specialty training in health psychology? How are you going to work with my physician? What are your fees? Do you accept insurance? Any good psychologist will answer all of these questions for you over the phone. If they won't, I suggest you move on to the next person on the list. So the important takeaways as we wrap up today is, the emotional impacts of your condition that has caused you to need to use TPN or HPN are consistent, and there's going to be ups and downs, and it doesn't necessarily mean if you're in remission that you're okay. So it's not as linear as we would want it to be, and so you can feel pretty low or pretty anxious at any time. So we want to try and intervene before those impacts become overwhelming to have the best outcomes. And most people can implement self-help strategies, but you got to give it time. At least 2 weeks, more like a month is really what I like to ask of people before giving up and trying something else. Use the technology, it's good. The apps are good. They make my life a lot easier. I use them with my patients as well, because they can really give you access, access to a therapist one hour a week where the technology is always there. And really, feel comfortable reaching out to a professional if you continue to struggle. And that's all I have. I'll hand it back to Andrea. Thank you for your time and joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Taft. We will now welcome any questions our audience may have for you. If you haven't done so already, please feel free to submit your questions in the questions section of the toolbar on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. We had some come in while you were presenting, so let's start with, are more doctors and hospitals moving towards a biopsychosocial model and encouraging patients with a new diagnosis to access mental health resources? My own experience experience has been very trial and error and forging my own path with less guidance from an actual team of providers in regards to my mental health and coping mechanisms?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. I'm going to say yes, that this is the direction that many places are going. I say that with a bit of hesitation because there are two issues. One is there is a shortage of mental health professionals in the United States, and I would argue in the UK and other places, who are working with patients with chronic illness. So yes, there is definitely a shift in how physicians are approaching, especially in the digestive disease world. We've seen a nice change over the last few years of much more embracing of the role of psychologists, but there is a gap in implementation. So your doctor may say, I totally get, the mental health impacts and the need for you to be connected, but I don't really have anyone to suggest for you. And we are working really hard to provide a better network for patients to access the experts in the field to help you. So yes, but much more work is needed.
Mhm. Okay, next question we have for you is, have you noticed a trend in the utilization of social media that encourages patients to develop their identity around their diagnosis in an effort to gain a sense of community, i.e. tubies, spoonies, etc.?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a percentage of people that are drawn to social media, and right, they use the term spoonie, or in my world, crony, or we all have a nickname, so to speak, and some people really benefit from that community and that identity. Some people, I think it does overtake their identity more than it should, and it can cause some problems in functioning outside of that community. And then other people don't do it at all. So I think um, there's, I don't know a percentage, unfortunately, of people that do it, but I think social media has been a wonderful thing to bring community together, but I think we should also limit our time on social media and look up from the screens and get out into the world as well.
Excellent. Another question for you, Dr. Taft. Earlier, you said that sexual functioning was one of the most significant factors in determining HR quality of life. Do you know of any organizations or resources that discuss this issue in more detail? I feel like this is a pretty significant component of living with a chronic illness, particularly if it's genetic, that is lacking dialogue.
Yes, there are psychologists who specialize in sexual health and sexual function. From a patient organization standpoint, I am not aware off the top of my head, but I can look into that and get some information to Oley that could be shared as part of the webinar. I do know through my work with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation Patient Education Committee, they are putting sexual health materials on their website. So my hope is through Oley and other foundations that the sexual health information can be more readily disseminated, where patients are already kind of congregating, as it relates to their condition, instead of having to go to a separate organization. So I know the CCF is spearheading that, and I'd be happy to help Oley with that. So there are resources out there, but I think we need to kind of get them organized better for patients to have easy access to.
Absolutely. Another question for you. What would you say is the most important coping strategy for someone who is homebound and has low energy?
Move. Please get up and move around every day. Even if it's taking a lap around the dining room table, it really is important to move your body, even though that seems like a contradictory thing to do when you have low energy. Take a shower or take a bath, do basic self-care, and then find an activity that is value-based and meaningful to you that you can do in your home. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It just needs to be something that you can look forward to doing regularly, so that you can get some of the things I was talking about in the presentation while still being at home. But that basic kind of getting up, moving a little bit each day, I think is the biggest coping strategy.
Great. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we are running out of time, but if any more questions come in, we will post the answers to those on the Oley website. Feel free to check out our coping strategies for IV nutrition and tube feeding page on our website for great tips, information, and patient stories. And thank you again, Dr. Taft, for an excellent presentation. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you also to participants for joining us. We'll post a recording of the presentation on the Oley website in case you want to view it again. And we hope you can join us again for on October 8th, when Dr. Taft will again be presenting more towards the caregiver aspect of it, of you need self-care. What can I do to cope with being a caregiver to a loved one on HPEN? To view our schedule of upcoming webinars and past recordings, visit the Oley website at oley.org/webinars. And that is all for today. Thank you, and I hope everyone has a great day.